last fall, the Whitney Humanities Center sponsored an event that basically featured some of the panelists here and others. And a number of our community tried to go to that event, which was called Collapse. What Collapse? And it was completely sold out. And I said to Harvey, I said, we need to bring your show on the road here, back to FES. And so that's what brings us all here. Just a quick introduction of the three panelists, and then we're going to go straight into their presentations. We're going to start off with Harvey Weiss. Harvey is a professor in the he's a professor of Near Eastern Archaeology in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at Yale, and he also has an appointment here at FES. In 1978, Harvey initiated the first American archaeological project in Syria, and he proved two things. One was that there were early 3rd millennium BC dry farming cities in Mesopotamia, and two, that there was extensive rain-fed agriculture could generate cities as large as those generated by irrigation agriculture. Quite interesting. So for the past 25 years, Harvey has developed excavation, regional survey, and paleoclimatology strategies to test societal responses to century-scale abrupt climate change in the Near East and surrounding regions. He recently just edited this volume that I highly recommend, Mega Drought and Collapse, that's published by Oxford. Try to get him to sign your copy. We also have Joe Manning as a panelist. Joe is the William K. and Marilyn Milton Simpson Professor of Classics and History. He's also a senior research scholar at the Yale Law School. Classics and Law School, that's pretty interdisciplinary. His current research is situated at the intersection of paleoclimatology and the economic history of the pre-modern world. He's particularly interested in ice core science. He is part of a team that's been looking and trying to understand the explosive volcanic eruptions, the impacts of those on the Nile watershed. They have focused on the Ptolemaic period so far, but plan on extending their study through the late antiquity and examining the interregional impacts of climate change across the Mediterranean. And then we have Robert Mendelsohn, who is the Edwin Weyerhaeuser Davis Professor of Forest Policy. He's also a professor of economics. He's also a professor at the School of Management. The focus of his research is valuation of the environment. Many of us are familiar with his work. He has developed methods to value natural ecosystems, including a range such as coral reefs, non-timber forest products, ecotourism. He's also developed methods to value pollution, including emissions and hazardous waste sites. And his most recent work values the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, including the effects of climate change on agriculture and forests. So without any further ado, they're each going to speak for about 15 or briefer minutes, and then we're going to all jump up for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here with you all outside of the classroom and to present to you the results of our seminar, our workshop, our faculty workshop last October, briefly and quickly, as the three of us participated in it. Our participation consisted of 13 persons from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South, across the United States, specialists in paleoclimatology and archaeological science and the historical sciences, and as well us from Yale University, who are going to attempt to synthesize the results of that weekend-long workshop for you. The first of our problems, of course, is collapse and its relationship to climate change. And here is collapse identified in the archaeological and historical records as essentially political breakdown and regional abandonment, known from high-resolution archaeological and historical records. And here is the pre-instrumental climate changes that we learn about through the 5 famous paleoclimate proxies: marine, lake, speleothem, glacial, and tree ring data. and the actual sources within those proxies and the resolution of their dating, which you can see extends to annual and subdecadal across the board. And the most famous of these 5 now being speleothems, which are a real focus of research these days because, of course, they provide stable isotope values for both precipitation and temperature, and as well subdecadal to subannual resolution with dating as far back as 500,000 years. It's really a set of remarkable records that derive from cave ceiling drip evaporation and calcite stalagmite formation. Together with these, we understand the varieties of pre-instrumental climate change, that is precipitation, temperature, seasonal to interannual variability, decadal to centennial climate change, abrupt and gradual climate change, and drought and megadrought climate change. As well, we understand the varieties of societal collapse and their causal dynamics, that is climate alone, monocausal, multiple causes, concatenations of negative events, tipping points, mushy democratic multi-causality, as I prefer to call it, or the attempts to define causal weighting, and what is most recently appearing in the paleoclimate record, abrupt onset and abrupt terminus megadroughts, that is, droughts extending for more than 10 years with precipitation declines greater than 2 standard deviations off the mean. So here is an analysis of megadrought and causality. On the left, you can see the 3 vectors of megadrought, that is abruptness, magnitude, and duration throughout the paleoclimate record. And on the right, an attempt to understand the varieties of policy-making decisions in yellow squares and the independent natural variability, that is the green circle, precipitation, as well as the societal vectors that are affected by both. That is the way in which agricultural production and its divisions within a society are affected by natural variability of precipitation, as well as policy-making decisions. Complex. The analysis of all of this in the pre-instrumental record, of course, depends upon dating resolution and quantification, subsequently with modeling. Here's one example of what happened 4,200 years ago relative to what happened only 10 years ago. 10 years ago, drought across all of Southwest Asia. 4,200 years ago, drought across all of Southwest Asia, and the observable, through archaeological means, societal responses to megadrought. That is, habitat tracking to refugia, which are both swamp, karstic springs, and rivers. Here are some of the ways in which this problem has been treated over the past 20 years or more. The first in 1988, explaining everything through the law of diminishing returns. To my mind, essentially a total failure. Secondly, Jared Diamond's attempt in 2005 to explain everything as they did it to themselves. To my mind, an essential failure. And thirdly, my colleagues Mikanani and Yaffe in 2009, essentially a failure as well. That is denying the paleoclimate record as well as the archaeological and historical records. Lastly, to show you the vitality, the vibrance of this field today, here are 3 publications. The first earlier this year, Back to the 20th Century, Societies Collapse for Social Reasons. Duh. Secondly, Back to the 19th Century, It's All a Myth. And thirdly, of course, we are proud to present to you this, which is, lastly, or penultimately, some examples of what we're speaking of. Prominent New World societal collapses that you are already familiar with, from the Andes, from the Yucatan, from the Valley of Mexico, from Lake Titicaca, from the US Southwest, the Four Corners, and lastly, of course, Norse Greenland. How did these work? These are monuments of construction, but they are also monuments of collapse. And this is how we need to understand them in this particular situation. That is, more than 100,000 persons literally leave a monumental city that is greater than 20 kilometers in area. Or in the Maya realms of the Yucatan and Guatemala, more than 1 million persons leave the region at 850 AD, with a precipitation decrease, by the way, of more than 40%. The famous analysis of the Maya collapse in 2012 by Doug Kennett at Penn State University. Here you see the collapse events 1 and 2, which are coincident with the great Maya megadroughts. And here, an analysis, input, output, an attempt to model in crude fashion what happens, regional declines in precipitation, and all that they generate. That is, megadrought is a very powerful force affecting all areas of both agriculture and society. But are there feedbacks? Did Maya deforestation, in fact, contribute to the megadrought? And here we see a great big question mark, because of course, deforestation possibly contributes to decreases in precipitation, but in this particular case, But in this particular case, the source of the precipitation is in fact way distant in the Caribbean and couldn't possibly have been affected by local Maya deforestation. Another example that you're familiar with probably is from the US Southwest and the Anasazi Pueblo collapse, which takes place, as you can see in the lower right, at precisely 1280 to 1300 AD during the period of the great drought that affected that region. And lastly, some old world collapses from 2000 BC, from 1200 BC, from the 15th century AD, and the late Victorian Holocaust droughts of the 19th century, all of them which generate megadrought and habitat tracking. We first revealed this, so to speak, in the journal Science in 1993, the megadrought right there. And since then, over the past 25 years, we've identified on the left megadrought at 2200 BC from essentially Iceland to China, and the resultant paleoclimate proxy records across the old world, and significantly coincident with those megadroughts, these collapse situations that are identified archaeologically and historically. In the field, on the ground, regionally, this looks like the following. At 2300 BC, the following kind of regional settlement across the North Mesopotamian landscape. At 2200 BC, it disappears. 30 years later, it disappears completely for 250 years until it comes back with the return of precipitation after the megadrought. Here's what it looks like in histogram fashion. The horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is population, and you can see that population disappears during the megadrought and only bounces back at 1950 BC after the megadrought. Lastly, 3 lessons to be learned from all of this. Boy, am I fast. 3 lessons to be learned from all of this. The first is that Copernicus in the 16th century had already reduced our self-determination to heliocentrism and taken our place out of the center of the universe. Secondly, Darwin had already done the same thing more than 150 years ago in 1859 when he published The Origin of Species. And lastly, I would point out to you that Roger Revelle did the same thing in 1957 in his famous paper where he proved that terrestrial carbon dioxide in the quantities that we are producing it cannot be absorbed by the oceans. That's where you have that spike at 2000 AD in the right-hand corner. The second lesson to be learned is that megadrought in the past needs to be understood with changing climatic conditions today, and that we will not be able to understand the changing climatic conditions today if we don't understand the paleoclimate record. So here's the paleoclimate record from the Dendrochronological Atlas produced a couple of years ago by Ed Cook at Columbia University. Here is what it sees as the immediate future for us in the American Southwest. that is, prolonged droughts at the end of this century. And lastly, it seems to me that the lesson to be learned is that pre-industrial megadrought contrasts significantly with the present global warming that is firstly anthropogenic, the pre-industrial was natural. Secondly, a function of societal decision-making, our decision-making, which was not possible in pre-industrial times. And thirdly, that this phenomenon is entirely new. That is, here is the original hockey stick displaying the newness, essentially 40 years after Roger Revell's discovery in 1957. Here is the present, and with that, I would like to point out to you that I kept it to 15 minutes.
Oh, is this on? Can I just stand up? Great, okay. Well, that's a lot to live up to. I did not present at this great meeting, but I could have around 3 historical case studies, and there's no time to do 3 fully worked historical case studies. I guess the major points would be high-resolution climate proxies are changing how we do history, and at different scales. So long-term trends and short-term shocks, and how do we integrate that? And I'm so far most interested in the short-term shocks. High-resolution climate proxies, this is just 2 of several we could post up from 2011 and 2016. Ulf Bunchen and others, Ulf usually as the lead author in these things, understanding at different scales through tree ring reconstructions, cooling, warming trends, and also precipitation history, and how that's connected to important, is that a pointer? What's the pointer on this?
Pointer's right on top of
this guy. How these trends are related to history. So this goes back to 2011, but this is sort of what a lot of people are doing right at the moment. This goes back to the 2011 paper, and I'll come back to this in the final couple slides, but this is really rather an important one from the 6th century AD, which is really important for European history and for, in particular, Roman history. So not just European history, by the way, but what Bunchen and others have shown is that this affects the Eastern Roman Empire for sure, but also the Sassanid Empire, which collapsed in the Near East in the 6th century AD, the spread of Slavic peoples into Europe, and tremendous upheavals even in China. So it has an important global synchronous implications as well. So on one hand, there's that. On the other hand, this is presenting my work along with Jennifer Marlin and people like Bill Boos, who used to be here. He's defected to Berkeley, and Frank Ludlow, who used to be here, and he's defected to Trinity College Dublin, but we're still continuing our work. This is our paper that came out in October last year in Nature Communications, which is sort of what we're looking at as a methods paper on the connection between volcanic impacts and river flow, not just in Egypt, but also in the Near East. We focus on Egypt here to get at how large volcanic eruptions affect Nile flow, and not just a single eruption we know from our studies, but clusters of eruptions, like in the 6th century AD for sure. We can see that in the historical record. So I've gone from being trained in papyrology, that's my original subject in graduate school, to hanging out in ice core geochemistry labs in Reno, Nevada, because I'm so thrilled by this, the potential for actually doing historical work with high resolution proxies in ice core reconstructions and looking at volcanoes. This is Pinatubo, of course, which is really the only one that's studied in some kind of instrumental detail. Whoops, I'm sorry. Before and after from the space shuttle, showing the volcanic dust veil that circulates globally. It has geophysical impacts, of course, which there's no need to review really here. But a lot of the work is now being done on modeling volcanic eruptions. I was just at a conference in Tucson a couple weeks ago with tremendous advances already in the last year on this. So that's really exciting. For Egypt, some of the studies in the Nile River Valley, of course, the ITZZ is the really important thing. That's the geophysical mechanism. We're looking at rainfall in the early summer that hits, particularly the Blue Nile at Lake Tana here seasonally, is how Egypt works until 1902 when the high dam, where the first dam was built by the Brits, and then the high dam in 1970 or so. And the teleconnection between large volcanic eruptions, depending on where they are in the world, and the ITCZ suppression is just really the important thing. This has been in the literature before. This is, by the way, news to Egyptologists. It's news to Egyptian historians. But the teleconnection between volcanic eruptions and Nile flow is a real one. It's been studied before, a very famous paper in 2006, for example, and it's been pretty well modeled. And this is actually Trudy Starelmo did the CMIP-5 model response for us a year ago, just showing the drying out post-volcanic event, that the Nile River watershed dries out post-volcanic event. Just a single one, but you get the idea. Just the last 5, by the way, in this CMIP-5 model, last 5 eruptions in the 20th century. The point is that the size of the eruptions in my period, the last 4 centuries BC, are significantly larger than these ones in the 20th century, for example, and they're clustered together. So we're working on doing new models based on the fantastic new work at NASA GIST that's being done. In the work, what we've done with that basic idea, the teleconnection between volcanic eruptions and Nile River flow, is look at this historical record, both from the South Asian monsoon index, but also the Islamic record, the Nilometer record as it's called, which is one of the best historical climate records we have from the 620s AD to 1902 AD, an annual record of Nile flood heights, which a lot of historians have dismissed as being kind of fuzzy, not really accurate, kind of useless information. It's not actually useless because it actually responds to the volcanic record really well, and this is basically a composite of that response. Year 0, the year of the eruption, Nile water flow is reduced significantly, about 25% or so on average over the whole Islamic record. So that's pretty good evidence, and it actually corresponds with the South Asian index, just showing us that the monsoon rains are suppressed with volcanic activity, basically. So with that basic mechanism, what we've done is gone back and look at the last 4 centuries BC, we're still in ancient history, and look at the new chronology of the ice core data. That's the significant thing. This stuff has been redated now by about 7 years or so from when it was a couple years ago. That's really important. Historians couldn't use the record 2 years ago because it was off by 6 to 7 years or so. The new work by Michael Siegel and others that came out in Nature a couple years ago with the revised chronology, now things sort of line up. This is a visual, I know. There's a lot of statistics behind this. Trust me on that. There's no time to go into that. But we look at a whole series of historical records like social unrest that are well documented in the papyri, warfare, the shutting down of wars in particular, and a series of these really famous priestly decrees, which are sort of settlements of the kings and societies sort of after shocks to the Nile River, reestablishing political order. They all seem to line up pretty well with the volcanic record here. So it's not a surprise, but I think we've shown that there is a strong connection between Nile River flow or the suppression of it and a lot of serious problems, not necessarily collapse the way we think about it, but a series of shocks over several centuries that actually weakens the state pretty considerably. And because these are shocks that are discrete in the time series, we can actually see human response pretty well, given the fact that we have really good historical records from Egypt in the last 4 centuries BC, and we can continue that into Roman and Byzantine times, and so on. So that's really quickly. This is the famous paper that came out by Michael Siegel and al. And Joe McConnell from while they're both at the Desert Research Institute in Reno. This changes history. I think this is one of the most important papers in history, and it's in Nature from a couple summers ago with this revised chronology. Locke, of course, is pretty well known historically, so no need to redate that, of course. But the significant thing is back into ancient times, things were not so well established, but now back to 500 BC, things are really well established. I think this is the chronology everyone is using. The cool thing for me as I work in the last 4 centuries BC, by the way, a lot of paleoclimate is 2K, just because it's a nice number, which leaves out a lot of important history, but now we can go back. And with Joe McConnell, we're working on stuff through the early Bronze Age now with high resolution ice core chronologies of eruptions. I'm super excited about that, so it's taken me out there quite a lot. So this is the last 3 centuries BC, and significantly also, I think, this, which we're calling the Roman Quiet Period, which corresponds to the height of the Roman Empire, things are pretty quiescent volcanically, so it shows us that some periods of history are volcanically fairly quiet. Maybe we're living in one now, but things were not very quiet in this highly unstable political world of what we call Hellenistic history in the Mediterranean. Several large eruptions, several of them clustered together, which I think actually puts a different light on how we understand historical developments in the last 3 centuries BC in the Eastern Mediterranean, which are absolutely momentous periods historically. So we can sort of revise things, I think, pretty well, not only in Hellenistic history, but also with things like the fall of Rome. So going back to the Bunchen work, now that's been even further revised and refined, one of the things I find most fascinating about the ice core geochemistry work is we know at least approximately where the volcanoes were located, high north latitude, mid latitudes, or tropical or southern, given the nature of the deposit of sulfates into the ice. That's really interesting because the climate models are telling us about response given where the volcano is located. And hopefully the tephra people will be able to identify specific volcanoes, but at least we can identify more or less where the volcano is located. That makes a big difference. The high north latitude ones look like they affect the Nile watershed much more dramatically than tropical ones do, for example. But the reverse is true for the Euphrates, which we also have pretty well documented. Tropical and high north had the reverse impact. That affects regional politics and economies, of course, pretty well. So this is really nice reconstruction, I think. And the clusters of eruptions are interesting in this 6th century. Famously now, 536, 540, 547 AD, 3 huge eruptions, which actually put paid to a lot of things, including the Roman Empire, it looks like. Now we have to sort out exactly the proper historical analysis of this for sure, but 536, a high north latitude eruption, 540, a bipolar event, not because it's insane, but because the sulfates are in Antarctica, and Greenland, of course, means the relative location of the volcano is in the mid-latitudes or in the tropics somewhere. That has longer-term impacts, it looks like. Not just a single shock. A volcano does things for a couple of years, but potentially a decade or more, depending on the size of the eruptions. 3 of them together looks like they have even longer-term impacts. That seems to be what's going on in the 6th century AD, this momentous period of history. Lots of really cool records, which I could show you in detail. There's not much time for it, but the Rosetta Stone, you all know that. This is another one like that, a priestly decree that tells us in the 240s BC, sometime before this was written, there was massive problems with the Nile, which has never been understood. But we now know what's going on with the eruption history. Large-scale eruptions, a cluster of them, which shuts down this most important war of the Hellenistic era. Ptolemy III is all the way in, hitting Babylon, about ready to conquer the entire Near East, but is called back to Egypt because of massive Nile failures and a huge revolt, which he solves by putting it down with military, but also importing huge amounts of grain back into Egypt. So the crisis kind of averted, but the counterfactual would be, what if Ptolemy III had annexed the Seleucid Empire, put paid to the Seleucid Empire, which he was on the verge of doing? That would have changed the history of Western Asia, presumably. But he's called back, and history takes a different course. How do we integrate weird sort of texts like this? You can't actually read this. This is a really famous text. It's a prophecy called the Oracle of the Potter, which has always been understood as an anti-Greek tract by priests who hate Greeks, and they want an Egyptian ruler to rule Egypt. There's a whole series of these prophetic texts, by the way. Many of them think of the book of Revelations as well, with descriptions of climate data in here. And I would read this rather straight now. This was written in the 2nd century BC, probably the middle of the 2nd century BC, at a time of massive Nile failures and multiple eruptions, which is rather nice. And it looks to me like this guy is describing a failure of the river. The land is scorched, but unnaturally. The sun will darken as will not be willing to observe the evils in Egypt. Interpreted by historians as the sun god, Re, is so embarrassed about conditions that it doesn't appear. That strikes me as a volcanic dust fail. This is what I want it to be anyway. This is describing volcanic impacts of the Nile River. Okay, I slightly overinterpret, but it's very tempting, of course. The farmer is pressed for taxes, which he didn't plant. There's fighting in Egypt because people will be in need of food. This is a plain description of impacts of Nile River failure to flood, quite literally. So rather than taking this metaphorically, which is how everyone has taken this text, and there's a huge literature on this thing, I read it rather straight now, and it fits really well with what we know of the volcanic sequence in Egypt. Rather cool, I think. The 40s BC. Evidence does appear to add up to a picture of widespread disaster in these years. That is the sentence on the 40s BC. That's basically it. We know there's eruptions of Etna in 44, 42, but there's an absolutely enormous eruption also in 44 BC, probably El Chichon in Guatemala. That's one of the largest eruptions in recorded history. And we know there's a now failure for several years in the 40s. We know there's plague in Egypt that's described by the personal physician of Cleopatra. We don't know what it is. It's a bit of a mystery. But Egypt is a mess throughout the 40s. Why? Because of pretty massive Nile failures, presumably, not just because the politics are goofy or Rome is doing things with Cleopatra. That's also an important element, to be sure. But the 40s look like there's serious Nile failures, which have never been understood historically, and a series of eruptions, including this huge eruption at El Chichon, is probably the explanation, which also has effects, by the way, in East Asia with massive famine in China, also in the 40s BC. Now, I'll just conclude here by citing this great work by Kyle Harper, which just came out, which is like the 150th explanation for the decline and fall of Rome. To be sure. It's a brilliant book. It's really well written. What does he take advantage of besides the volcanic redating, which he does? Paleomolecular archaeology. That's the new great field, paleogenetic study of disease, origins of disease, modeling how it spreads and so on. And the basic argument is it's the 6th century AD with these 3 huge eruptions and, to be sure, cooling events that have this dramatic effect, and it weakens Rome. Through a series of plagues, the Antonine plague, pretty important one, of course, which is smallpox, very probably, and the Cyprian plague, which is bubonic plague, probably in 541 it breaks out. But dramatically, it's not a single event. It's actually, let me get it right, 38 events over 200 years, the Cyprian plague. That is really dramatic. The result of this cooling, and he explains this really well, what he thinks is going on in terms of the history of and the spread of this disease. It clearly has an impact on the later Roman Empire and the creation of what's called now the late antique Little Ice Age, Lalia, which is the latest, greatest periodization that we have now. It looks pretty certain with the proxies here. Probably launched by a very large eruption, a series of them. There are other things happening too, of course. But this has been proposed as a new periodization just a year ago. And that's what Kyle Harper is sort of fitting into with that. He sort of gives you a history of the spread in the cities. It turns out that Roman urbanization is a really good thing, and it's a really bad thing. Because it concentrates the disease and it's spreading from these cities. And he reconstructs with this really brilliant paleogenetics work the history of these plagues and shows pretty well that this stuff is really important, that it's connected together. So it's not just a political framework, just let me conclude, which is how ancient historians always work. It's 100% politics. It explains everything. No, there's a hell of a lot more going on than that. For sure, these are complex societies. And just to mimic Harvey's point, the way we have to work as historians, I'm on a mission to do this, is we have to work in coupled natural human system feedbacks. We're not being determinists, saying A causes B, of course, that's often the criticism still. We're actually trying to think about coupled natural human systems with negative and positive feedbacks. Okay.
Good.
Okay, so Professor Weiss has been working on this for a career. He was the leader of this entire effort in the fall, and he's a major force in looking back in history. Professor Manning, as you just found out, has become an expert on the climate Egyptian part of this, as part of the later part of his career. I'm a guilty economist. History to us sort of began around World War II. So all of this is new to me. I was kind of a spectator for most of this. But one of the things that I have been doing is spending an awful lot of time trying to figure out what's the impact of climate change on us now and what will it be into the future? And it turns out that one of the questions that this whole conference brought up is, well, can we learn anything from this past? Does this past help us at all in telling us what to do and preparing us for where we're about to go? So one of the things, since World War II, we've measured is that CO2 levels have not been constant. They've been rapidly rising as part of burning fossil fuels. And we've just gone through a little bit of discussion about that particular problem. This was man-made, coming from our own actions. And it's led to a mental model that I was walking around with, that things were beautiful, that we were in Eden for a while, and then all of a sudden we got involved and we've messed up, and that's the hockey stick, Alan Mann's, somebody's man's hockey stick that says, okay, we're in a new world we've never seen before, and it's all due to our own fault, and we don't have any past experience to tell us anything about how to get ready for this. So one of the things that was really interesting for me to find out is, well, that model, mental model, is actually a really bad mental model of the history of the planet. And that if you actually look at the history of the planet, nature hasn't been constant. It's been moving around for a long time due to things that have nothing to do with mankind, because we're going way before mankind even existed. And one of the things that's interesting is that the Earth used to be a lot warmer. It's had a long period where it was a lot warmer. And it's only in the last million years that it's gotten a lot colder. But there's two things in this. One is that the world's gotten a lot colder. The second piece that's in this world is it's gotten much more volatile. There used to be the climate, this temperature, was pretty stable. But then in the last 1,000 years, a million years rather, it's gotten very unstable. So the actual picture of the thing is not that we have a flat, perfect Eden. The thing is actually that the planet is actually somewhat volatile, and climate is not at all stable. It's been bouncing around a lot. And in particular, it's been bouncing around a lot because of wobbles in the Earth's atmosphere that were formed by India crashing into Asia and forming the Himalayas. So apparently that is an interstellar reason why we've got this huge variance that's suddenly showing up. But what we're interested in this conference is much more recent history. This is a period where man actually shows up at the end of this. And what this is showing you is exactly what those oscillations we just saw in the previous picture actually look like, coming from now going back for the few 100,000 years. And you can see that there's been a lot of these rapid oscillations. And one of the things that's very clear is that the planet has been going through rapid temperature changes for a long time, followed by long cooling periods. And that this is actually our history. And part of the reason why we're upset about global warming is that we're at the top of one of these warming periods, and now we're making it even warmer. So that's why you're getting temperatures we haven't seen that are warmer than ever before. It's because this is on the top of a 10-degree warming from the bottom, and then we're adding more to that. So one of the things you're learning is that, well, one of the things I learned is that, wow, nature's not stable. We've been living through these 10-degree swings in Celsius for quite a long time. And that all the ecosystems that have survived these. That is, this is not that the ecosystems have all been at current temperatures. They've all had to survive the fact that you're going through all these swings. What's really exciting about this conference is that scientists have gotten much better at measuring more recent climate. So we always had a temperature record that created after we had thermometers and things, but that's only like 120, 150 years old. What's the recent evidence is that it's going back much further than that, and it's getting much more accurate. So we're starting to be able to see periods where the climate in different parts of the world has actually swung away from what we view as the modern record. And one of the things this reveals is that even recent climate, that is on the top of one of these glacial interperiods, the climate still bounces around a lot, and that you see extremes in the climate. That is, natural forces create lots of extremes. And one of the things that is exciting about this is, because this is evidence that is just recently available, is that we can now connect that to all sorts of things that have happened in human history. That is, it's one of the things that's available now that was not available before, is we can start to link these changes in climate to consequences that we can actually observe through history. And that's what was really exciting about this conference. realizing how many of these records are now available in all different parts of the world, and then recognizing, second, that, wow, these things can have all sorts of implications for us. So the most obvious thing you want to go after first is the very things that were just talked about. What happens in the most extreme cases when the temperatures go up a lot, when the temperatures go down a lot, or when precipitation suddenly disappears? And one of the things we find is that they're coincident with civilizations falling apart. So we're seeing this collapse, evidence of this collapse, when you see these very extreme events occurring. But it turns out there's more to this story than that. It turns out that you also can see periods where the temperatures have been warm before. You can see periods where they've been very wet before. You can see periods where things are getting better, they're getting worse. It turns out that all of this history is having some kind of influence on societies in different parts of the hemispheres. So the idea of linking all sorts of historical developments with these climate changes is very exciting. And it's giving us a sense not just of decline and collapse, but also growth. When do societies grow? When do they prosper? What causes warfare? Well, a current idea is that warfare happens when we have scarce resources, but it turns out historically you couldn't have warfare unless you had an army. You couldn't have an army unless you had wealth, and wealth only occurred when you were prosperous. So actually, warfare was more likely in some of these cases when the society was doing the best, when conditions were the most optimal. And then societies had extra welfare, and they built temples, and they built huge cathedrals, and they built big armies. And so one of the things you can start to see is, wow, this is a very complicated world we're looking in, but when we looked at the history in the past, we knew nothing about what the climate was. What's going on now is we actually do know a lot now about the climates, and we have the precision now to link that to actual historical events. So that's the next super exciting part of this. This is another place. We're going around in different parts of the world. This is getting information in the Mekong River Delta, and this is now not tracking temperature so much as tracking precipitation. And one of the things you see is that there were some very volatile, well, maybe you can't see it, but there's some very volatile periods way back there in the 14th century. And it turns out those are coincident with the failure of Angkor Wat, the abandonment of that society and their movement out of that region and the abandonment of that civilization. Now, in many other civilizations, what's happened subsequently is when precipitation has returned, some form of a previous civilization has also returned. In the case of Angkor Wat, nothing has returned. So one of the interesting questions is, well, when do these things happen, these catastrophes occur? And then when the catastrophe is over, do the societies rebound? Or does the area just get abandoned and forgotten? So there's tons of questions that this kind of data brings out. And my last slide is just trying to get across the idea that in addition to collapse, you also can have growth. So this is now talking about the area around Mexico and southwest United States. It turns out there have been gigantic swings in precipitation. That area tends to be very volatile. It is volatile today, but it's been even more volatile in the past. That's one of the things that's important to recognize. And one of the things you can see is there's been periods where precipitation went from unusually low to unusually high. And they've been coincident with the developments of different societies, different civilizations have been built during those periods when precipitation has been rising. So it's fascinating to look at this and to just begin to get a taste of what you can learn from kind of connecting these swings in climate to changes in society and things that can happen in the future. And one of the things you can realize is that, well, climate change is not new. It could be that man-made climate change is new, but it turns out precipitation temperature changes have been going on for a long time and will continue to go on. Whether we control greenhouse gases or not, these natural forces are still out there causing all sorts of changes in our future climate. And one of the things that's interesting is trying to go back and learn from these periods of natural climate change. What are the impacts on human society? What have people done to adapt? And how much does it explain of both good things that have happened in the past, that is growths of civilizations, as well as declines? So this is exciting to me because what it's saying is we have a lot more evidence, a lot more places to look to try to understand how climate affects mankind. We don't just have to say, oh, gee, what do we know since 1945? Well, we're trying to eke out every little thing you can learn since 1945, but the changes that have happened in the past are far more dramatic than anything that's happened in the last 80 years. And so opening up all this history as a mechanism to learn about the link between climate change and mankind is just super exciting. So that was the main thing that came out for me personally in this particular meeting. So what it means for you is, wow, there's a whole bunch of new things to study. That it turns out that history is full of interesting experiments in some sense with the role climate plays on mankind. Thank you.
No.
Harvey.
Okay, we have time for some questions. Before I open it up to the audience, I want to get my question in very quickly. Taken together, your presentations point to the fact that when you look over a longer history, clearly the climate has affected the collapse of societies. What would be your response to those who say, well, we're exceptional now? We have technology. Technological advances are so different today than it was before.
Well, go ahead, Harvey. You want to take a first shot at that?
Well, we could consider, for instance, the situation in the American Southwest, where mega drought repeated in the past seems very likely to occur in the near decadal future, and we could consider the ways in which that mega drought in the past made it impossible for societies to maintain themselves in the Four Corners region, for instance, or in Western California. And we can consider the ways in which we've attempted to ameliorate that situation in the recent present. That is, we've introduced irrigation from the Colorado River into California and other similar regions that are going to be mega drought affected. We have the physical means to treat certain kinds of mega drought situations, but it seems very unlikely that we could actually survive mega drought in the American Southwest. That is, multiple decades of 40% reductions in precipitation are going to affect more than the artichoke crop, or more than the development of more orange plantations in California. They're going to affect the ability of urban life in the American Southwest. That is, water is not going to be available.
I would add, just really quickly, there's a huge dam being built at the Blue Nile headwaters in Ethiopia, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, that you probably have all heard about. It's the largest dam in Africa once it's online. If you read the impact study of that dam, there's not a mention of volcanic impacts in there. So one wonders, with a large eruption or two, what that does to hydroclimate in a really sensitive part of the world, East Africa. It's not monsoon dependent. With the change of politics, Ethiopia now controlling 83% of Nile flow, which is significant.
So I think one of the points Harvey is making is that globalization has, to some degree, made us more secure, because if one particular region collapses or doesn't do very well, we can depend more on other regions to balance things out. And that's not something that was easy to do in prehistoric mankind. But it's true that we are still quite dependent on the climate. A lot of our modern agriculture, for example, is designed specifically for a mid-latitude temperate climate. And if we don't have that anymore, it turns out those particular crops were all designed for the wrong climate. And we might find ourselves where we've actually invested a lot of our capital, a lot of our knowledge in growing crops in a place where we don't actually have any more. So we are, in some ways, more vulnerable because the things, we depend more on the climate than we have in the past in some ways. But in other ways, I don't think that, for example, if the Southwest lost half of its precipitation, it would necessarily collapse. The things that need a lot of rainfall would have to go away. They would no longer have to be able to grow lots of crops. They would have to reserve that water to having remaining cities survive. But that means that other parts of the United States, other parts of the world will have to provide the food that they can no longer provide for themselves. Climate change, especially just the natural changes that are part of the historic record, could result in dramatic reallocations of people. And just looking at those glacial cycles, one of the things that we are due for is another glacial cycle. That is, we only have maybe 10,000 years of this warm period, and then it's going to start getting colder again. And if it starts getting colder again, that's going to be very dramatic. Tundra, which we think of something that happens way north in Canada, will start happening in Connecticut. The whole sea won't be rising; it'll be falling dramatically. There will be dramatic changes on the planet that are in our near future that are part of the natural part of this planet.
Well, I don't think they're in our near future. I think they're...
Well, near future, in the future. I don't mean near. I said 10,000 years.
Right. The present period that we're in, we're 10,000 years into the interglacial right now. That is, the entire Holocene to this point, the past 10 or 11,000 years, is an interglacial. Approximately 10,000 years from now, we're going to see the return of the glacial. So we've got 10,000 years to do whatever we want.
Before the end.
So we have lots of hands, so why don't we take a round of questions, and then we'll go through a second round. So we have a couple of microphones. I want to make sure we get all four of these folks.
So thank you for this great research and the detail that it requires and publishing it. But I was curious, and maybe it came up at the conference, that the issue of population wasn't mentioned. I mean, clearly that this is a moment of anthropogenic change, social decision, and new. But if you go from 2 billion to 6 billion in 1 century and now up to 7 billion, the anthropogenic factor is huge. And it's not going to be so easy just to say natural climate change in the past was one thing. So that's just a factor that I think we all need to, put into the equation here. And I'd be happy to have your comment.
I'll stand up. Thank you. We've had a lot of emphasis today on climate and climatic changes and how that's affected the past and could affect the future. None of us are single cause people, so we know that there are many interactions. And yet, Professor Weiss, you had about 30 seconds per slide to get through other interpretations. And what I'd like to ask is if you could pick a very small collapse, maybe a Nauru or an Easter Island or something like that, and just share how the climatic part interacts with the other social, socioeconomic, socio-ecological variables, and how that's played out in a bigger picture of a smaller thing.
Yeah, please. Sorry, Peter.
Oh, well, this is rather related. The question is basically, how do you measure resilience in ancient societies? An equivalent shock, of temperature, rainfall, or whatever, can have very different effects depending on the social stability. And often inequality is invoked as a factor undermining resilience. What do you think is the connection between inequality, resilience, and climate shocks?
And my question probably tied into previous questions as well, because I was curious, it's sort of hard to tell on the scale of these diagrams, but it's evident that we've had climatic changes, dramatic climatic changes in the past, but do we feel they have ever occurred at the rate at which it is occurring right now with the compounded anthropogenic effects? Is the rate of change in our climate happening faster or similar? Do we have any evidence of the rate being the same as it has been in previous examples?
Sure. Well, I think there are two questions I can deal with. First of all, Professor Perdue's point about resilience and the way in which societies are able to respond to climate change. I think I tried to represent the varieties of climate change. That is abrupt or gradual, mega drought or just drought, annual, interannual variabilities. And so different societies, dependent upon their strengths, their weaknesses, their fragility, the fragility of their agricultural systems, are of course going to respond to these different types of climate change. And one of the points I was trying to make with regard to the variability on each side of the equation, or the variability of the forces on each side, is that there is a prominent feature of the Holocene, the past 10,000 years, that inserts for the first time into our reckoning megadrought, which previously we didn't understand. And that megadrought in these prominent instances is in fact what makes it impossible even for highly resilient, strong agriculture systems to maintain themselves. That is, as I was once quoted in the journal Science as saying something on the order of, it's hard to eat when there's no food. And that really sums up my understanding of this issue to some extent. That is, the megadroughts make it literally impossible, no matter the strength of the agricultural system. Even irrigation agricultural systems are affected by megadrought. That is the reduction in precipitation. So, and a second point with regard to the rapidity or the acceleration or the rate of climate change that you inquired about, it's not entirely clear just how rapid our alteration at the moment is going to be. Not entirely clear. That is, how many decades worth will generate precisely how many degrees centigrade of increased warming. But it is clear from the paleoclimate record the rapidity or the abruptness of these high magnitude alterations in the past. That is, they occur literally within decades. That is, you go from a state which is high precipitation to a state which is low precipitation, essentially 2 standard deviations less precipitation or more, within decades. That is, less than a century, within 10, 20, or 30 years, which is an astounding new realization about the nature of climate variability on this Earth in its natural state, without the provocation of anthropogenic climate change as an accelerant.
I would also add with Egypt in the long run, you can see clear contrast over 4,000 years. I think it's a value of looking at this, the different scales of climate change from the Old Kingdom collapse, which is clearly a 4.2 Ka event, to what the Ptolemies are doing, which is not going away completely, but huge struggles and a lot of social tension because they're very high taxers. They're fighting the largest wars in Mediterranean history, so they're extracting a lot of resources, and they're putting in the ground free threshing wheat all over the place, which was not there before, which is drought sensitive. And so they're actually putting risk into the land without knowing it because of this new fiscal and economic system that's being introduced after 300 BC. So you can see long run and short-term differences in how the politics shapes human responses and things like revolts because of this, these short-term shocks even, not collapse, but short-term shocks are enough, it looks like, to cause pretty widespread social unrest.
In terms of trying to compare this with what we think greenhouse gases are going to do, if you just look at this recent history, it looks like the period we've gone through so far is similar to some of the things that have happened just before greenhouse gases accumulated, that it's going at roughly the same speed. But if you look at the projections of what greenhouse gases might do in the future, the speed of this could rapidly increase of temperature change. But one of the other things that's interesting about looking in the past is there's been some huge cycles in precipitation, and we haven't seen anything like that in recent history. So I think we haven't seen all the things that nature can give us as part of the precipitation cycle. And that's going to be also quite important to us. It's not just temperature. What happens in precipitation will also be critical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Whew. Yeah, that was a compact hour.
I know.
A lot, it was pretty fast.